It was dark and iron smelling, hot with the closed-in heat that brings the sweat out, as though it had been waiting all over your body for the right signal. Anvils stood around or lay on their sides, and chains hung down, covered with coarse, deep grease. The air was full of hooks. There were sharp points everywhere, tools and nails and ripped open rusty tin cans. Batteries stood on benches and on the floor, luminous and green, and through everything, out of a high roof, mostly, came this clanging, hammering, meant to deafen and even blind. It was odd to be there, not yet seen, paining with the metal harshness in the half light. This is a fantastic and memorable description of the inside of the Greiner Brothers garage. It's very, very much a sensory appeal overall. The effect of the description is to really confront us primarily with this almost insupportable sense of sound, the hammering sound, which has been foregrounded in the previous paragraph, the hammering from the galvanized garage. Have a look at how we start this. It was dark and iron smelling. It's quite a subtle touch, that iron smelling. Normally one might think of saying something like this. It was dark and smelt of iron. It was dark and smelt of iron. That's the normal association I think we would have in our mind when we write it out. But when you say iron smelling, you create a subtle change, a shift in the intensity of the description. First of all, by saying smelled of iron, you're using three words. And when you say iron smelling, you're creating what is essentially a single term, a compound term. You're fusing two words, iron and smelling, together. And by doing that, you intensify it. You give it a greater strength. It's more powerfully, more powerful in its appeal to the sense of smell, this olfactory quality in the opening of the description. So we're hit immediately with this intense smell of the iron, which is not designed to be appealing, of course. Hot. Now we move from the olfactory to the haptic, the sense of touch, the feeling of heat inside. Oppressiveness immediately then is injected into the opening of the thing. The sense of sound is oppressive. The heat is oppressive. It's designed to immediately capture for us a place that we don't really want to go into at all. Hot, with the closed-in heat that brings the sweat out. Notice the sounds here: hot, heat, that, hot, heat, that. It's all these sharper T sounds, isn't it? Hot with the closed-in heat that brings the sweat out, as though it had been waiting all over your body for the right signal. Even the sweat here is suddenly animated by the personification. It's as if the sweat is just waiting to come out, waiting for the right signal. So just to recap then, an overtone from the outset in the beginning of this paragraph, the first sentence signals to the reader that this is an oppressive place to be in. And there is even a very faint feeling of claustrophobia when he uses phrases like closed-in heat that brings the sweat out. There's a sort of suffocating sense of enclosure, which is certainly in the physical sense relating to the heat, but also it's as if the sound itself is suffocating. Notice how he brings this out again through the rest of the paragraph. Anvils stood around or lay on their sides. Again, the verb choice, stood and lay, it makes it seem as if they're living things, doesn't it? You know, the idea that they're not just inanimate objects. It could have simply said, there were anvils, either on their sides or simply upright, but he doesn't. He uses those verbs, stood and lay on their sides. Essentially, it's a subtle element of personification, isn't it? Giving these objects and in almost a sort of physical presence that's beyond merely being things, they're alive. And again, that makes it subtly menacing. There's a feeling, of course, of lethargy created by that too. you know, they're standing around, not doing anything, or laying on their sides, maybe because of the oppressive heat, if we take the personification as our cue here. And chains hung down. Again, that's a rather grim image, simply isolated, by the way, by the commas there, covered with coarse, deep grease, elaborating on it. I like the way in which the punctuation definitely slows us down. We can't skip ahead swiftly and just skim over the description and move to the encounter, because there's somebody in there, isn't there? There's somebody there hammering away, and we're going to see our characters, particularly Lewis, obviously, speak to this person about, in this case, arranging to have the cars moved, as we said. But the thing is, we don't get to that person yet. We're in the setting first, and the setting is deliberately presenting a feeling of menace that will now be connected to the encounter that we're coming to. But stay with me on that last section there, the second sentence. The chains hung down, covered with coarse, deep grease. Again, alliteration with the sharper C sounds of covered and coarse. The visual quality is very apparent, isn't it? Thick, ugly grease that's hanging on these chains. The air was full of hooks. That's a great clause there, isn't it? The air was full of hooks. You can see it in your mind. This is the interior of a garage, and something where people work on metal, of course, some kind of mechanical workshop. And it's got these hooks suspended in the air everywhere. It's really alarming, isn't it? What are they for? And there is a sense of danger suggested. You could accidentally have one of these things jab into you as you're moving through it. The air was full of hooks. There were sharp points everywhere. By the way, of course, that simply builds upon it, doesn't it? The air was full of hooks, sharp points everywhere, tools and nails, and ripped open rusty tin cans. That sentence is all to do with menace, physical danger. The objects in this place can hurt you. They're not physically capable of doing so by themselves. Doesn't matter. The feeling of menace is there. Tools and nails and ripped open rusty tin cans. Ripped and rusty, and more of the alliteration at work. The whole of that sentence, by the way, divided into three sections. Hooks begins it, sharp points continues it, and it closes with nails, ripped open rusty tin cans. Can you hear the sharper T's and S sounds there as well? The rusty tin cans, that sibilant effect of those hissing S sounds and the sharper T sounds. All of it's designed to create that overall atmosphere of forbidding presence. You shouldn't be there. It's time to get out. Batteries stood on benches and on the floor. Once more, that verb, not as if it's working quite as in the same effect as the anvils. Nevertheless, it's the verb. Why not say batteries were on benches, or there were batteries on benches, stood on? It's all giving this sense of vivid visual detail, a concrete immediacy. Stood on benches and on the floor, luminous and green. An unusual word there to use, isn't it? Luminous and green, giving it this kind of glowing or shining quality. It's almost eerie. Luminous and green. I love too the open vowels, the rolling vowels, loom and green, these open rolling vowels. It creates that almost mysterious, eerie quality. And through everything. Now, in this sentence, we move towards the sound again. And through everything, out of the high roof, mostly, came this clanging hammering. Of course, the onomatopoeia strikes us immediately. Clanging hammering with the assonance of A sounds again, the A's in clanging and hammering, meant to deafen and even blind. An unexpected and dramatic association. The sound is so fierce, it's so intense. Yes, we understand that it can almost deafen, as it were, which is a hyperbole as such, but we get the sense that it's really unendurable, but it's cleverly made even more so by the idea that it's so overwhelming that it not merely affects the most obvious sense, the sense of sound, but even sight, which is impossible, of course. In effect, this really has the same association as we find with synesthesia, doesn't it? We've had this term before, haven't we, synesthesia? We know that it is essentially a neurological condition in human beings, but as far as language and literature is concerned, it is that deliberate merging or confusion of sensory association. So in this case, sound is used to essentially appeal through, being appealed through the sense of sight. So sight is the vehicle through which sound is being understood. And of course, it's impossible. But what it does is it magnifies, it amplifies the overall sense of how powerful, how insupportable and unendurable this sound is.